Pixie, have you ever wondered why New Zealand isn't a part of Australia? No? Well, you're a cat, I suppose. But neither have I. I really regret wearing a white t-shirt when I have Pixie in my videos. I'm covered in black hair. Anyway, no, I've never wondered why New Zealand isn't a part of Australia. And for starters, it is quite far away from Australia. It doesn't look like it, and from the northern hemisphere, we don't think it, but it is quite far away. Anyway, let's educate ourselves. Let's go.
New Zealand. Alongside being the current reigning champion of places that people forget to put on maps, it's also an independent country. This independence did not occur through one single event like that of the United States, but through a century-long process of reform. And across this century, many were fairly sure that New Zealand would become a part of the new Commonwealth of Australia, in the same way that Quebec was obviously going to be a part of Canada, or how Bombay was obviously going to be part of India.
But straight away, the maps can be deceiving. Like I said, from maps quite often shrink the southern hemisphere. So it always looks like things are closer. Now, it's almost like saying, why is Turkey not a part of the United Kingdom? Or as in land mass wise. Now, obviously, it's going to hopefully talk about the historical side of things, the British invasion, more or less. But it's from the obvious side of things, it's because it's really far away. I would assume.
Yet, as you'll know, this never happened. But why? Why isn't New Zealand a part of Australia? To begin, we have to go back to those ancient days of pre-Australia, sometimes called the mid-19th century. At this point, Australia wasn't one colony, but instead 6, and they were, as far as the British were concerned, a part of an 8-colony collective, the other 2 being Fiji and, of course, New Zealand. All of these colonies had different economies, different foreign interests, and different cultures, which is why, at first, many were opposed to federalisation.
Surely straight away, that is one of the biggest things, that their cultures are completely different. Now, it's easy. I think it's quite easy to lump in, for example, the cultures are similar. The Maori, for example, are similar to the Australian Aborigines. But that's only saying it from an outside. That's not saying it is true. But as an outsider from the other side of the world, it's seen as these primitive type cultures when they're not. They're not. That's not necessarily the case. You can't just lump them as all being the same. It's like saying all Asians are, a Chinese person is the same as a Filipino, or a Chinese person is the same as a Mongolian person, because it's Asia. They're not all the same. It's completely different.
Things changed when Germany started eyeing up the region, which made those in the 8 colonies pretty nervous. And when the colony of New South Wales changed its mind about federalisation, the other colonies now feared being left out, and thus it was time to build an Australia. For New Zealand, this being cut off was less of a problem. Whilst New South Wales, Tasmania, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia and the other one may have traded primarily with each other, New Zealand traded mostly with Britain. There were other reasons for New Zealand rejecting federation too.
Straight away, talking about trade. Now, since obviously Brexit has happened, we've decided instead of trading with our next door neighbours, we're going to trade with people halfway around the world. Makes sense, obviously. It's like you've got a supermarket on your doorstep, but choosing, no, screw that. I'm going to go 100 miles down the road to another supermarket. Silly. So back in those days, it would take even longer. The trade between Britain and New Zealand would have been so much longer than it is today. So you can, on that side of things, but even then it's like, I don't know, Australia trading with China doesn't make them the same country. This is confusing, and I don't understand why you would ever think of New Zealand as being part of Australia. But people do. I'm sure people do. Madness, I know.
The first was the massive distance between itself and Australia, which for reference is the same distance between Britain and Morocco. Another was that the drafting of the documents for Australian Federation were done by those who lived in Australia, which might sound incredibly obvious, but New Zealand and Fiji weren't given an opportunity to contribute much to the discussions, and thus they were largely seen as places that would be added to Australia as opposed to a foundational part of it, which upset many New Zealanders who wanted to be seen as equals. And this lack of consideration for New Zealand's distinction is what mostly scuppered any chance of it being a part of Australia. You see, New Zealand had a long and storied history between the island's indigenous people, the Maori, and the European settlers, the Pakeha, and there were concerns that integration into Australia, a place not highly rated on the kindness to the people already living thereometer, would mean that the Maori would again be reduced to second-class citizens and importantly violate the Treaty of Waitangi, which as a result would lead to another war. There were fair reasons to believe this, since the draft constitution explicitly stated that the indigenous people were to be ruled over by the whites there, and New Zealand thus demanded that this not apply to them and that they would refuse to join unless Australia amended its constitution, which it agreed to. So why wasn't this enough? Well, it was mostly a concern by New Zealanders about the number of Chinese and Asian workers in Australia, and particularly the potential that those workers would head to New Zealand, which the leaders there really didn't want. And when Australia federated in 1901, it was these combined reasons that saw New Zealand sit it out, although there is still a clause in the Australian constitution that allows New Zealand to join whenever it wants, so the door is still open. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
That's really interesting, actually. I didn't think it would be... I didn't realise that actually it was... The doors are open for New Zealand to become Australia. I don't know why you'd want to become Australia, because you're your own country. You know, you've got your own cultures and your own political system and beliefs and everything. But that's actually quite interesting that the idea of unification was there. And it almost happened. It almost happened. Now, this is obviously a very short animated documentary, and it doesn't go into massive specifics, but it's interesting to open up that idea, as I said, of that there was that possibility of New Zealand becoming a part of Australia. Strange as it may seem. Well, it's not something I ever thought of, and not something I ever needed to know, but it is interesting. It's interesting to know about the history of different countries and locations. And once again, it just shows really how much the Brits are complete arseholes. And I will lump Europeans in that as well, because they did their fair bit of conquering and yeah. But fair play. I tell you what, fair play to the Maori and New Zealanders for resisting. I think that's probably a good thing. However, it was partly because they were scared of having the Chinese invading. And when I say invading, I don't mean invading. I mean like nationalist Brits think that the Europeans were coming to invade. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you might have learnt something new. It'd be interesting to know if you're from New Zealand and you knew there was the doors open to be a part of Australia. And if you're Australian, would you like New Zealand to be part of Australia? That's interesting. Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure you like and subscribe. Dislike if you disliked it. And I'll catch you next time.